Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Gerard Seijts and Kimberley Milani, it is a pleasure to be able to have both of you on this podcast today. I am thrilled to be able to have this conversation. I got a copy, an advanced copy of your latest book, Character: What Contemporary Leaders Can Teach Us About Building a More Just, Prosperous, and Sustainable Future. And I loved it. I loved it for so many reasons, not least of which because I'm a huge fan of character and character strengths and truly believe that when it comes to meaningful work, character is a lot of the answer. So I'm excited to be able to have this conversation with both of you today. Perhaps we can just start with just some brief introductions. Perhaps each of you can start. Gerard, why don't you?
Sure. Well, thank you, Andrew, first and foremost for the invitation to have this conversation today. So my name is Gerard. I'm a professor at the Ivy Business School in London, Ontario, Canada. I joined the school in 2000. I was the inaugural executive director of the E&O Inatowicz Institute for Leadership that was founded in 2010 as a direct result of the global financial crisis. We have several aims at the Institute, and the one that speaks mostly to me is the following. We do all of this to develop global leaders who have strength of character, strive to make a difference, and contribute to the flourishing of individuals, teams, organizations, communities, and society. So I think it's fair to say that since 2010, all my research, all my teaching, and all my outreach are largely aligned with that particular objective at the Institute. And quite frankly, Andrew, that gives me real meaning. It gives real meaning to the work that I'm doing at the Ivy School.
Kimberley, how about you?
Yeah, thank you as well. I'm really pleased to be here today and to have the chance to talk to you about this. I think I could echo so much of what Gerard has said, but just to start off with, I'm the director of the E&O Inatowicz Institute for Leadership at the Ivy Business School, which is a part of Western University. And I joined the Institute in 2017. Prior to that, I was in another area of Western University called Brusca University College. And I was the director of the Circle Women's Center and also a founding member and director of the Institute for Women in Leadership there. And Brusca was, until very recently, Canada's only women's university. So it was a very interesting transition for me to come, after being years within a women-only environment dominantly, to come down to a business school and lo and behold find this institute that directly spoke to and mirrored the experiences that I had had previously and really tapped into what I had learned through my years at Brusca and then expanded upon them in such an amazing way that allowed me to take my previous learnings and be able to articulate them to a brand new audience. And like Gerard mentioned, the part that he read to you about contributing to the flourishing of individuals, teams, organizations, and society, that really is what gets me out of bed in the morning. That's what provides meaning to all of the work that we do. And that's what essentially when we're working with students and other executive audiences, that's where you see their eyes light up. You know, that this really isn't just, a typical professional development session. This is something that hits them very deeply because it's a part of us talking about and hopefully cultivating who they are as a person. And so it touches them in a different kind of way. And that brings a lot of meaning to the work that we do.
I can tell you both that my first encounter with the Institute was actually pretty close after you started, right after the financial crisis. At the time, I was working at BMO Financial Group in their Institute for Learning and their Faculty of Leadership. And even in those early days, Mona Malone, who I believe is is maybe the chair of the board at this point for the work that you guys are doing. She was leading our faculty and was rightly obsessed with some of the work that you were doing. A lot of it because of the fact that it so deeply resonated to this idea of character. So maybe let's go there. I know that character is so much of what you do at the Institute, and certainly what this book is all about. Can you tell us a little bit about what character means and where this idea comes from?
Well, those are two different questions, so I'll try to tackle them. Where this all came from, and you mentioned of the word rightly obsessed, is really interesting because a lot of people were. So let me tell you very briefly the story, the background, how the Institute came into being. And as I said earlier, we were founded directly as a result of the global financial crisis. The onset in 2008 and 2009, and of course, a lot of people thinking, reflecting, how was this allowed to happen? And most importantly, what was the role of leadership in all of this? And the question had to be asked because presumably the people at the very top of these organizations, not only financial services industry, but a great many organizations were often seen as the best and brightest, had access to the best educational institutions, and yet on their watch, this was all happening. So we initiated this project, and by we I say myself included, but a number of Ivy faculty, really thinking and reflecting, people from finance, strategy, economics, leadership, and so forth. We actually wrote an initial paper. But you know what they say about academics, right? They're kind of live in their ivory tower and oftentimes detached from the larger kind of community within which they operate. Now we disagree with that, but let's give that to them. So we actually held a great number of conversations with leaders in the public, private, not-for-profit sector organizations in most of Canada's major cities. We went to New York, we went to London, UK, we went to Asia, and had these conversations about the paper that we wrote, and we invited their feedback, their criticism. Are we too harsh? Are we too lenient? What are we missing? Where are we playing wrong? All, of course, under the Chatham House rules, because we wanted that absolute candor that would give us some insight in how leadership contributed to this very messy situation. Now, all those learnings were captured in a very small book, very thin book, about 100 pages, Leadership on Trial, a Manifesto for Leadership Development. And here's where it gets interesting, because there is a very short sentence as to what we believe good, effective, strong leadership entails. Goes as follows. When it comes to good leadership, competencies count, character matters, and commitment to the role of leadership is critical to individual and organizational success. And I will tell you, Andrew, that is a really interesting sentence because the biggest surprise to the entire research team was the frequency and the passion with which people spoke about character. Now, we had many kind of ideas, observations, perhaps assumptions when we went into these kinds of conversations. But this notion around character was debated time and again. But we ran into two major problems. You ask 50 people, well, then help us understand what is leader character? And is this something that can be developed in people? And there was a huge uncertainty, maybe even disagreement about what it is and whether it is something that can be developed. So what a great opportunity for us, because people were just looking at us, at the research team, to find answers, because people cared about this stuff. And so one of the very first things that we had to do was to give this clarity around character and what this means. And so to make a long story short, we anchored our work in Aristotle, Peterson and Seligman, as well as Schwartz and Sharp, who talked about this before, right, extensively. And so the way we looked at leader character, that for us it is kind of virtues, these behavioral patterns, routine, almost habits, not of any behavior, but behavior that contributes to the well-being of individuals and societies. So, of course, you end up with the work of the thought leadership of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, etc. It's not to say that there wasn't any work done in this particular area. Some of it was of help to us, but a lot was not. And so we committed to a research program, because if this was so important to leaders in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, or organizations in those sectors, we need to have the language, the vocabulary, because that was largely lacking. And so for 3, 4, 5 years, great number of studies, qualitative, quantitative. At the end of the day, about 5,000 people, leaders, managers, employees involved in that actually led to what we call a leader character framework, where we identify through rigorous research and conversations 11 dimensions, what we call, of character that really matter. I'll tell them, I'm sharing with you in the audience: accountability, collaboration, courage, drive, humanity, humility, integrity, judgment, justice, temperance, and finally, transcendence. Now, those are, in some cases, expensive words, but I'm a behavioral scientist. When I said earlier, these are habits or habits of behaviors. So what are the behaviors? So on top of those 11 dimensions, we have identified, again, not through our brilliance, but with the help of a great many leaders, managers, and employees, a set of behaviors that are illustrative of those dimensions of leadership. We call them dimensions, not virtues, because again, language is really important. Not a great many leaders in, financial services industry would, talk about kind of virtues, but dimensions of character or character dimensions is a little easier, right? So 11 dimensions and the supporting behaviors. And as I said earlier, since 2010, when we started this research, everything that I have done, the research, the teaching, and the outreach, has really been focused on bringing that notion of leader character into the discourse, the development, and the practice of good leadership in organizations. So that's a long way to articulate how we ended up. And quite frankly, it has completely redirected my research and teaching career. And I must say, as said at the outset, it's a great area. It's important that we bring this into the conversation, especially in business schools.
I think this is it's so interesting that you're talking about this work. And by the way, if you're interested in that framework for leadership character, we will absolutely put those 11 dimensions onto the blog post for this episode. So just go to eubd.ca/podcast and you will find this episode and the corresponding page with a summary as well as all of these frameworks that we're talking about. But I guess, Gerard, I'm curious about what the relationship between all of this character concept and the topic of meaningful work. I mean, that's what we're here to talk about today.
Of course, and I will try, and I'll approach it from 2 different perspectives. Maybe first from the individual kind of employee, and then from a leadership point of view, and align it or try to connect it to the work that you have done in your writings, Andrew. So here we go. The first example, the first kind of hook, I want to use an example. And, you may have heard about this, and it is actually debatable whether this is a true story, but it is a great story. And goes as follows. It is 1962, and President Kennedy now is presumably visiting NASA and is introducing himself to people at NASA. And he sees in the hallway, he sees this janitor walking with a broom in his hand. And so he's introducing himself to the janitor. Said, "Hi, I'm Jack Kennedy. And what do you do?" And the answer on the part of the janitor was perhaps a little bit surprising. "I'm helping to put a man on the moon." He was just not some janitor. He clearly knew his role in the overall NASA organization and clearly aligned with the goals of NASA at that particular time. He knew that his contribution actually mattered. If I take care of the trash, the garbage, if this is a clean place to work and operate in, then I help to put a man on the moon. So again, the role for him, his purpose was crystal clear. It gave him meaning. Now, what has this to do with character? One of those dimensions of character is this transcendence, to always see the bigger picture. Could even maybe link the janitor's behavior, right, to this notion around humility. That's one of those linkages. That's why I believe that leader character is closely related to the sense of meaningfulness. It's a great resource for people to have, to activate those behaviors that give us meaning to what it is that we do. I'll also talk about leadership, because leadership, of course, is really important, because I could easily argue, and this should be a really important question. That mindset of the general, what a great mindset to have. Now, you and I know that leadership is critically important. So what can leaders do to accelerate this particular mindset? Or how can leaders create the context, right, for which meaningfulness or eudaimonia actually occurs? Now, as I said, Andrew, I read your article. I thought it was wildly fascinating. I will use it in my own teaching, but something really tweaked my interest. And you talked about the Surgeon General in the United States, and so that not too long ago, this particular report was released, the framework for mental health and well-being in the workplace. And this particular report identified 5 key pillars or action points: mattering at work, opportunity for growth, work-life harmony, connection and community, and protection from harm. And Andrew, not to state the obvious, but it doesn't take much to really link those pillars to particular dimensions of leader character. I can think about humanity and how foundational humanity is to connection and connectivity, perhaps especially in very challenging situations. Compassion, empathy, understanding, critically important to get at that notion around community and connectivity. I can think about the opportunity for growth and how important collaboration and humility are to this. And maybe this is a side issue, but let me explain this. A lot of talk these days about leader as host versus leader as hero. Leader as hero is very directive, maybe even bordering on the arrogance, because those people might believe they have all the answers. But you and I know that we live these days in very challenging times. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. Case in point, COVID. Nobody really understood what was happening at that time. And here's where good leadership kicks in, or leader as host. You collect around the table the best and brightest, people that might have something to say. Nobody knows the answer, but that's not the point. Your role as a leader is not to be right at the start of the conversation. I want you to be right at the end of the conversation. So this conversation, this asking questions, this humility, this collaboration, maybe that felt sense of connectedness, where jointly we work through our challenges. We are open to discordant information. That is a great opportunity to learn and develop as people. We might learn something new. And finally, this notion around justice and how important that is, right, to mattering at work. Fair treatment, equal treatment, or, what the Surgeon General talked about, right, in the sense of a living wage. I can easily see how this notion around justice and activating those behaviors and practices help us deliver on those pillars that lead us to well-being, health, and this deep sense of belonging that so many people crave. So that's how I see how character actually might be related to meaning at work.
Thank you, Gerard. Kimberly, I'm curious. This can seem heady and theoretical, and I know that you work with all sorts of different kinds of leaders. Why do you think that character is so important for leaders to wrap their heads around?
Actually, I think there's multiple reasons. So since we're not going to be here all day, I'll give you 3 that I think are really, really paramount. One of the things that we haven't maybe articulated out loud, but if people go to your website and look at the framework, is that all of those dimensions of character that Gerard talked about them are those 10 dimensions: transcendence, drive, collaboration, humanity, humility, and so forth. They actually operate in concert with one another to inform and impact our judgment. So they all coalesce. Even if you look at the model, it's a series of circles surrounding judgment, because they operate in a networked fashion. So that's something that we really talk about a lot through our work at the Institute is character's impact on judgment and decision making. So why I would say one of the reasons that this is really important is that as a leader, one of your ultimate responsibilities is to make decisions. And you want to make those decisions with good judgment, which, again, so as we've said, relies on strength of character, especially if you want to enact good decision making in any type of sustained way where it has really impact on how your organization operates. And if you think about that, what happens over time when there's a consistency in good judgment, it leads ultimately to performance excellence within the organization. So again, like Gerard was saying, the competencies, character, and commitment. So it is important to remember that character is separate from your competencies or the skills or talents or knowledge that you bring to the table. And one of the ways we like to highlight this or capture that is we talk about how competencies are about what you can do, but character is about what you will do. And a lot of times those can be vastly different things, especially when you look at failures of leadership, whether those are in the midst of a crisis or actually more prolonged and systemic that build up within an organization. As a leader, you also want to see the presence and accumulation of good decision making within your executive teams, your mid-management cadre, and really all the way through the organization. So that's one reason to wrap your head around it. Character matters for your judgment and decision making. Another reason why I think it's really important for leaders to understand character's importance is that ultimately every single human being in your organization is going to bring to work with them your own unique character. We all have one. It's a part of the fabric of our being, and we can't unweave that from ourselves from 9 to 5 or from whenever we punch a clock. So therefore, when we hire someone, we don't only hire their competencies, but even more so their character. And if our organizational performance and well-being is impacted by the individual and collective character of our workforce, like why wouldn't we wrap our heads around that really significant aspect of it because of the impact it has? And the fact is, and I've encouraged listeners to think about it in relation to their own experience as leaders or as maybe within their own lives, is we often highlight how we hire on competencies. Our resume is stacked with, the education we've achieved, the experiences that we've had, our previous job history. So all the competencies we bring to the table, but it doesn't reflect anything about our character. And unfortunately, usually when we go to fire someone, it's because of poor judgment and decision making based on a weakness or a compromised character. So we hire on competencies and we fire on character. So sometimes when we highlight this and the enormous impact character has on the organization and how every single person within it has one, it seems almost ridiculous that we've been ignoring something like this for so long. And then the third reason that I'll say, and Gerard touched on this a little bit in his previous answer related to meaning, but that character doesn't only contribute to performance in meaning economic performance or risk management, innovation, competitive advantage, all of those sort of organizational things, but it's really foundational to areas such as the enlivening and enactment of organizational purpose. And it shapes things like organizational culture, and it impacts efforts towards equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that's very much based on the fact that character includes dimensions like humanity and humility and justice and collaboration. And so if people are going to find meaning in their work, they need to be in a workplace that allows them to flourish personally as well as professionally, and character directly impacts that. So there's 3 reasons why I think it's important for leaders to wrap their heads around that.
It is interesting to just reflect on the fact that notion of judgment being at the center of all of these aspects of character very much aligns to, again, what Aristotle thought about the mother of all virtues being wisdom, or the idea that figuring out how to use your virtues, in the right kind of judgment, in the right situation, in the right context, was ultimately the ultimate goal of what a life well lived was. That was the point of eudaimonia in so many ways.
And just to interact, because that notion of wisdom, of course, is critically important. We didn't want to retain that notion of wisdom. We translated that to judgment, because in the eyes of many people, wisdom, you're Gandalf, like you're old and gray, but you don't have to be old and gray to show wisdom. It is, in the end of the day, it's about good judgment, that situational awareness. So we played around just a little bit with the words, the terminology, but as I said earlier, fully aligned or very much aligned with the early work of Aristotle.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'll kind of continue on that thread for just a second because I think it is important to think about the ways in which we translate these words or these sentiments into language and ideas that resonate with the audiences that we're talking about. You mentioned Seligman and Peterson, and of course, one of the, Martin Seligman is one of the fathers of positive psychology, along with Chris Peterson and many others. But at the very beginning of this movement of positive psychology was this desire to say, you know what? Psychology has gotten really good at telling everything that's wrong with us. We have the DSM, a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental illness, but what would be the equivalent on the positive side of the spectrum, which is character? What is our character? What are our strengths and our virtues? And so, of course, one of the very first things that this field of positive psychology tried to do was wrap its head around, what are the universal strengths of character that do exist around the world. And I appreciate the fact that there's a huge amount of overlap between what you have created in the framework, and there's also some substantial difference in terms of what it actually means to utilize those strengths in the context of leadership and in the context of business. I'm just curious if you want to say anything more about the relationship between your framework and that VIA framework that exists.
Yeah, we've always said that we stand on the shoulder of giants because for us, it really started with Peterson and Seligman and Aristotle. But here's what we also found, and this is no criticism because the objectives were very different. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that Peterson and Seligman's work was really geared towards the general population, right? The Values in Action Survey, etc. So when, for the very first time, I used that particular survey with an executive audience, and I'm not kidding, they were rolling their eyes after 10, 15 minutes when I started to debrief the results of this instrument, because it had words like love and zest. Nobody talks about that in professional business organizations, or not a lot of people, I should say. And it's not that these words are unimportant, they are. But love, perhaps, and it's slightly different, compassion is more accessible to people. So we realized at the start of our journey that with a very good foundation, but was it the best foundation? That's why we went out there and really listened to what people shared with us. Peterson and Seligman, 6 virtues. We have 11. So we expanded on that work. We tested that. We're still an academic institution. Research is everything. I always challenge people, is this perfect? No, very few things are perfect. Is it workable? It's workable. And it seems to resonate with a great number of people. So, I think, Andrew, there's a lot of really interesting thinking out there. And I would say, in all humility, we are a framework. I think it is a pretty good framework. But other researchers are doing a really interesting and important work in that same area as well. That works for them.
The other thing, Kimberly, that you talked about was the relation. I love this kind of notion of competencies being what you do and characters being what you can do. Competencies being what you can do and character being what you will do. Where does commitment fit into that? The third pillar of leadership.
Yeah, so, well, we also talk about that the fact that character actually underpins both competencies and commitment. So, in terms of commitment, character informs elements like your drive, the passion and vigor that you will bring to it. So even though we talk about them as, kind of a 3-legged stool, like something that needs to all be present for good leadership, we do caveat that there is that underpinning. So, you can have all the skills in the world and you can be essentially a virtuous person, but if you aren't engaged or, passionate about what you're doing, you don't have that commitment to the role of leader. And I mean, leadership is a lot of work, and it can require a lot of sacrifice. It can be lonely. And so if you don't have that commitment there to sustain your engagement in that role, then again, it sort of topples that stool a little bit, that leadership stool. And so, but what we do say is by cultivating or working on aspects like your drive, your courage, perhaps, and another bit, it shores up that commitment. It feeds it. It fuels it. And so So that's where we think commitment comes in.
You mentioned earlier that everyone has their own unique signature of character. Each of us is different in different kinds of ways. How have you found it most helpful to help people understand their unique signature of character?
In terms of how I help people understand, really all I can do is offer to bring awareness to 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 the construct or the idea of character in the first place. Really, then it's about people coming to know themselves, which really is the age-old question. But one of the things that I think is really important, that in terms of the starting place, because it can seem kind of maybe amorphous or daunting to to start exploring this kind of thing, is to just start with reflection and introspection. Just to start with really understanding that we need to have a think about who we are and how we show up in the world. And, and show up in the world broadly, not just at work, but whether that's as a parent or a partner, spouse, coach, volunteer, what have you, like, within those sort of myriad elements of our life. And so to engage in deliberate reflection, I think, is really, really critical. And to try and determine what dimensions are strong within us, and perhaps ones that need a little bit of work, a little bit of development. And we can do this by, reflecting on a particular event, and then looking about how our character impacted, or essentially the decision that we made within that, or our subsequent behavior. And we should do that actually when we achieve a success and a setback. So this isn't just, this isn't an encouragement to ruminate on failure. Rumination doesn't really do anything. It just allows us to wallow. What you want is introspection, which is reflection for the purpose of improvement. And so success teaches us something that we've done well. It also can shore us up and make us understand that what we're capable of. And then, obviously a lot of us know that we can learn a lot from our mistakes. And I think this intentionality and deliberateness is really important. A lot of people talk or believe like we learn from experience, but that isn't quite exactly true. We actually learn from reflecting on experience. And as human beings, if we learn simply as a consequence of experience, then I don't think history would repeat itself quite as often as it tends to do. Mm-hmm. So really, reflecting, introspection, for the point of cultivating self-awareness, to really create that starting point within yourself. And, interestingly, when we're talking about this in different presentations or whatnot, we do sometimes highlight the work of Tasha Eurek out of Harvard, who makes the case for developing self-awareness. But really, her research has found that most people believe that they're self-aware, when actually it's pretty rare. And over the course of many studies, her and her team have estimated that only about 10 to 15% of us actually fit the criteria for self-awareness. So that's why it's really important to start there, and then we can move forward. I have to say, when I start doing presentations to executive audiences or others, the first slide in my PowerPoint deck contains a quote from a French feminist philosopher named Simone Weil that states, "Attention is the purest and rarest form of generosity." And so I really think we need to give ourselves the gift of that attention. And the kind of attention we always referring to isn't, kind of the strained focus, like narrowing down into a singular event or a singular thing, kind of, if you remember echoes when you're young, pay attention, it's really constrained. And so what she's talking about is where more of a negative effort, where attention is contemplative rather than constrained, and it allows for an expansiveness of our thoughts. And such, it allows us to kind of rummage around in our own being and discover aspects of who we are, or maybe even parts of ourselves we didn't realize were there, or maybe we didn't want to admit that were there. But that attention is key. And then actually you can move on into other external methods for, discovering more about your character. One of the things that I would encourage people to do is actually have conversations with people in their lives whose feedback that they can trust, and trust to be honest. Again, parent, partner, friend, colleague, mentor. Mentors are great. And they can give you that feedback that this is how they're seeing your character show up. The last thing I'll say is, from a very practical method is our institute has created a psychometric assessment. So we call it the Leader Character Insight Assessment. And you can take that, and based on your answers that are, of course, all probing elements of and behaviors of your character, it provides you with your results. So you'll get a report that indicates what areas are strong and what areas need some work. But then it also is accompanied by a pretty comprehensive document, about 35 or 40 pages, that provides a range of resources for each particular dimension of character, and different resources that will help you on the journey of developing your character.
Thank you. As you're talking, I've been thinking, my head's still back with Aristotle. And I'm thinking even earlier than Aristotle, the Oracle of Delphi had, I think, two major inscriptions. One was "Know thyself," and the other was "Everything in balance." And so I think about the 10 dimensions of leadership, with judgment as the 11th in the middle. Within your framework, I'm thinking about the notion of Aristotle, that he talked about the fact that character always exists within a golden mean, or possibly a different way of saying that is every character, every virtue, every element of positive character exists on the continuum between two vices. I can either do too much of something or too little of something. And in fact, before Chris Peterson died, one of the things that he was working on was actually relooking at all of the character strengths and trying to say, hey, maybe we've thought about mental illness completely wrong throughout our whole entire life. What if mental illness was actually just the overuse or underuse of a character strength, which was a really interesting perspective. I'm curious what you think about how that relates to the 3 C's. I'll give that to Gerard. Do you want to take that one?
Sure. And so I would have two responses to that. I think that is completely embedded in our model once you take a look at it, because we never look at these dimensions or virtues in isolation. Because, Andrew, we actually already outlined kind of the challenge with that. Courage in excess, it becomes recklessness. In its deficiency, vice form, it's cowardice. We don't want that, because we need courageous people given the particular context, situation, etc. And yet, if I can go back to the global financial crisis, you could easily make the argument, and I've done that in the past, that to a great extent, this has very little to do with competencies, but had a lot to do with character. Incredibly driven people, accountable people, courageous people, almost like a Viking mindset that actually went at things, almost unrestrained. What if we had married that with a sense of temperance, restraint, and self-control? Maybe a little anecdote, or kind of, of course, as a Dutch person, right? Even though I work and live in Canada, I follow Formula One because of one person, Max Verstappen, the Dutch Formula One driver. Any driver, by the way, for that matter, wants to win the cup. You want to go as fast as you can. You want to plank this, right? Like, you go. But at some point, like real life, there might be an obstacle, a setback. Time to just step back just a little bit. That's that temperance. That's why we always say it would be the wrong mindset to say, listen, academics, 11 dimensions, that's insane. Why don't you give me 3? Oh, you can't? Then I will work for my strengths. I know my strength is my drive, and here I go. But if we ignore that dimension of temperance, for example, we invite reckless behavior. I'll give you another example. Certainly in leadership and leadership development, growth and development, we need to have these candid conversations. Absolute candor, Andrew, for me to tell you why you were passed over of this promotion, why perhaps the presentation didn't really resonate or land with the audience. That candor is part of integrity. But, I know he's a very, good person. For me to tell you this is hard. Nobody wakes up on a Friday morning, going to the office and telling Andrew or Kim that she didn't get the promotion. It takes great courage to sit down with a person, to look him or her in the eye and have this very candid, reflective conversation. But candor does not mean I can be mean-spirited to you. That can be a jerk. That's candor, but, the wrong candor. It needs to be married to empathy and compassion, because I don't know exactly what the last 6 weeks or the last 6 months have done to you. Maybe you came out of a very challenging personal situation. So my point is simply this, going back to this judgment piece. It is the integration of those various dimensions that make sure we don't go to the vice state. There's always that kind of combination to truly understanding that deep sense of interconnectedness amongst those dimensions to produce good judgment and walk away with great outcomes for the individual, the leader, and the organization. So that's kind of that virtue vice, that deep sense of interconnectedness. The second point, and I think Kim mentioned that earlier, we're not, of course, for the past, let's say now 13, 14 years, we've been talking almost exclusively about leader character, what it is, how to develop, how to bring it into organizations. Doesn't mean that we believe that it is more important, right, than competencies or commitment. They all work together. Our point is simply this: for far too long, this notion of character has not received the attention it deserves. But the reality is, if any of those 3 pillars, whether this is competencies, character, or commitment, if any of those 3 pillars is deficient or not working up to par, then you put the leadership or the organization potentially at a disadvantage. They're all necessary, but not sufficient to produce great leadership and great outcomes.
You've articulated the tremendous complexity of character in that response, which I think is part of the thing that you are striving for with your institute, with this book that you published, that there is a lot of complexity to leadership, and understanding the fact that character is such an important and vital piece of that it's a very different lesson than we're ever really taught in business schools, or at least has been taught in business schools over the last, century or more of business education. And so I one of the things that I actually just want to point to in the book that you published, Character, is the fact that you bring this to life through storytelling. You have done these extraordinary interviews with, what is it, 15?
17.
17 different individuals, from Cameron Bailey to the Honorable Murray Sinclair, Neil deGrasse Tyson, incredible individuals who take leadership in radically different ways and bring their character, competencies, and commitment to life through storytelling, through those interviews. And I find it's extremely helpful because it helps make sense of that complexity in all sorts of different ways.
And there's many reasons why we wrote this book, but that was one of them. Because, at the end of the day, we're still academics, do a lot of empirical research. We publish this in hopefully, kind of terrific journals. A work gets traction, gets the attention, etc. But at the end of the day, the question is, what are you going to do with this? Because if this is so important, how would you bring this into organizations in the public, private, not-for-profit sector? And this is not, Andrew, just for leaders. I mean, we can talk about citizens and character and create better communities and better societies. So at some point, Kim and I were saying we need to write this book and actually make sure that more than just kind of academics actually have access to the research that we do. But how do we make people understand and care about this? And so one of the best ways is, of course, storytelling, to give that model, give it some color. And so our challenge, or one of our challenges, was, okay, so who could we talk to? Who could we pick that are really first-class stories about making this particular dimension come alive? I'll give one example. I'll turn things over to Kim. But, the one that actually still gives me a little bit of eye, right? Because we always said that framework needs to be easily understandable. 5-cent words, not $5 words. And yet you have transcendence. What does that mean? Now, of course, for us, the way we define this in the book, in our research, is people that have this or bring this sense of wonder to their life, to the role of leadership, our capacity to be curious, to be visionary, seeing new possibilities, displaying a very expansive view, right, of issues. So who can talk about this? And both for Kim and myself, there was one person, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist. And so when you talk to him, when you read a chapter, hopefully this comes across that this transcendence piece is really foundational, not only to science, because to a great extent he was talking about science, but to learning and progress as humanity. And he spoke so passionately about the overview effect. I'm not sure if you know what the overview effect is, but oftentimes when astronauts or cosmonauts go into space and they look back and they look at planet Earth, that changes everything from them. The entire perspective of life and the responsibility to care for Earth. That was such a great way to make that transcendence come alive. And quite frankly, I thought no better person than Neil deGrasse Tyson to talk to us about that. And we do that for the other 10 dimensions as well. And sometimes those leaders, they speak in their stories about more than one. But I think at the end of the day, they make the framework come alive in their words and hopefully give us a bit of inspiration to be better leaders, to be better citizens. Kim?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. We interviewed another astrophysicist named David Kipping, who's a professor at Columbia. And one of the things that, again, if you think about Gerard and I personally having the experience of interviewing these people, I think we got off every call and just, our minds were kind of blown with the insights that they'd shared, especially because a lot of them were just being introduced to our framework. This is not people who did have a deep dive and a deep knowledge like we did into it. So I think one of the things actually just thinking about that is it shows how really accessible the framework is once you actually just kind of sit with it for not even a long period of time. And so the interview with David Kipping, what I loved so much about that is he spoke of similar things, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and it certainly brought in that transcendence piece. But in doing so, he actually brought right to the ground the profound extraordinariness, that's not even a word, but like how incredible our humanity is. So by looking out at the stars, he made the case for just how important each one of us as individuals is and how special and unique we all are. And the thought of having somebody read that and maybe look at their own self, their own life, a little bit different, as a little bit more special, a little bit more important in contributing to the whole of humanity. The thought that they walk away just maybe with their head held a little higher and their shoulders back, that's absolutely extraordinary. So that transcendence piece, and really which translates into feelings of joy, is really exceptional. The other interview that I loved all of them, really, I got to say, but another interview that I thought had a really practical application using her story was Julia Hoggett, who's the CEO of the London Stock Exchange. Now, she's somebody actually who was familiar with our framework and had been for some time. And she used to work at the Financial Conduct Authority, so a regulator, a financial regulator before that. But she would have the framework stuck right beside the screen of her computer. And she used it as a decision-making tool. When she had to make big decisions, she would go around the dimensions and reflected to herself, am I bringing enough passion or drive into this? Is my integrity being fully utilized and present? Is my humility, do I need to learn more here before I make this decision? Is my humanity there, my passion? And yet, so she went around the whole wheel to make sure, or the framework to make sure that it was informing her judgment in a really right way. And one of the things that, Gerard alluded to the fact that, can't you just have a 2x2? Like, does there have to be 11? Yes, there has to be 11. But once you get used to that, one of the things she talked about is the dimensions are comforts more than challenges, because she said it's always easier to do the right thing, even if it's harder. And she said you learn that the more crises you manage. Even if it's difficult in the moment, the comfort and confidence that it's the right thing to have done is much more sustaining than having done just the convenient thing in the short term. So I think that's the beautiful the sort of juxtaposition as well as power of storytelling is that it can take us out into the cosmos and it can actually just be a very practical decision making tool. And those stories, capture the whole range in between.
Well, as somebody whose top strength is very likely transcendence, this particular interview has left me feeling high. Is there anything else that I should have asked you today about the relationship of character and meaningful work?
The one thing that I will say, I'll let Gerard have the final word, but the one thing I will say and that we talk about is that character is contagious. So if we're trying to create organizations that are filled with meaning, your strength of character, the character, actually your character, what you bring, into the organization for better or for worse is contagious. So if we really want to create organizations that provide meaningful work for people, understanding how your character impacts people's experience of meaning in their work can create a contagion effect that can ripple throughout the organization. So this isn't actually only about how it impacts your own self and your own performance, but how you can spread this throughout your organization, simply even through your own example. And then, if you want to double down on, developing character as, a very specific action of your organization, then that's great. But character is contagious. And so I would leave that as a thought of my own.
Sure, and then maybe I could end with this notion around which is not an easy objective, but Kim and I often talk about kind of transformation and personal transformations in our deep personal leadership, and I think character can offer that, right? I said at the outset that there was basically two main questions: what is it, and can this be developed? Of course, it can be developed. It's hard. It requires reflection and deliberate practice. But, at the end of the day, there was a 1987 article that always affected me deeply by Benjamin Schneider. The people make the place. It's not the systems that actually matter a heck of a lot, or the structures. Those systems and structures are always the outcome of people that make particular decisions, right? And simply changing structure or systems doesn't always do things. That's why it is important for these personal transformation and taking leadership or leader character seriously. And that actually brings me back, Andrew, to the invitation for us to have this conversation today. Your article, Meaningful Work, Well-Being, and Health. We've studied this through leader character. Other people have studied this too. And I think the scientific evidence is quite clear that this stuff, character, virtues, character strengths, matters. It is a foundational piece of individuals. It is a foundational piece of leadership, and it actually can contribute a lot of good, right, to a great many organizations. So this character stuff really matters, and I thank you for the conversation today.
Gerard and Kim, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. You're most welcome.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.